I met Shenali at a seminar that we're taking together with Dr. Manuel Castells, and I was really impressed and very interested with her work and the similarities that it has with with things that have happened in Mexico. So first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your research project.
Sure, yeah. So thank you, Iskar, for the introduction. My name is Shenali Pilapitya. I am a PhD student here at USC, and broadly, I study South Asian politics, but I'm interested specifically in sort of new social movements in South Asia, the reconfiguration of the political left, and these broad questions pertaining to occupation and protest and urban politics, but also interested in kind of the through lines and connections between mass movements, political movements, and leftist governance in formal politics. So that's a little bit about my research. I'm very interested in the case of Sri Lanka, which is my home country, and do a little bit of work now comparative on Bangladesh. So that would be my sort of main regional focus.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll start talking about this a little bit more in depth. But I was also you're also like, I don't know if involved or not, but you're like in there, like the information that you have is not secondary, it's data. It's like stuff that you have personally experienced a lot of these things.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I'm from Sri Lanka. I was in Sri Lanka in 2022 when the economic crisis happened and when the Argalea movement began. I participated in the movement myself. I'm not a core activist. We can get into kind of what I mean by that later on. But yes, a lot of my work is based on like ethnographic data and field work that I've done in my home in Colombo in Sri Lanka.
Okay. And our other guest for today is Alexander Dey, and he is located in Tijuana, from what I understand. He is from Mexico, and I know I've heard about your work from Jose, so I'd rather not botch what I'm going to say, and I'd rather let you introduce yourself, Alex.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Tijuana. I am a queer person. I'm living in Mexico City for 10 years now. I came to study economics here, and I got involved with social movements after the Ayotzinapa murder of 43 students, and started working with different social movements and NGOs from 2017. And recently, 2 years ago, we started this big network called Constituyentes. It's a network of 110 activists from all over Mexico, from people who defend territory and indigenous community to feminist LGBTQ activists. And we're trying to build collective power from the left to try to move reforms towards what we think is best, building this collective power outside of political parties. And we have been doing this for 2 years. I love this kind of work, and I have been experiencing how negotiating with government has changed between different governments. And I love the topics that we're going to discuss today, and the paper that Shenali shared, and the comparisons that could be made with East Asia that I would be really honest, I don't know much about, but I am willing to learn.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of similarities. Like when Shenali, I mean, she's gonna speak about her paper and the paper that she suggested, and but there's a lot of similarities, and I think you will have a lot to say, Alex. I have a feeling, and you are an economist by professionally, or is that what I recall?
Yeah, I majored in economics. I worked for a brief period of almost 2 years in the economics ministry when AMLO got elected, but I have since worked most of my life in politics and NGOs.
Right, so that's a big jump, like from economics to activism. It's like it's a big and it's not and not a big jump. So how did that happen? Like, how did you go from working as an economist with the government to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think it's a big jump, but a small nuance before. I think economics in the US is much more private sector and profits based, whereas in Mexico, economics major are much more political. But given that when I was working in AMLO's administration, I really believed in the project. I voted for him, I campaigned for him. I believed we were doing this kind of transformation for the poor people of Mexico. And when the pandemic hit, we were like commanded to write some plan for small, medium enterprises so they didn't got hit by the pandemic. And we did. After that, my boss, the Minister of Economics, talked in a meeting with AMLO, and he like didn't hear any argument. Talked all the meeting about how helping corporations was bad, but we were not talking about big corporations. We were talking about small, micro, and small enterprises from 1 to 10 employees. That after that got hit, 4 million of those small, medium companies were lost after the pandemic. And I learned that part of his populist ideas against technocracy, which I think Claudia has changed, made his government very bad administratively. Like they were not able to execute policy, although they had good intentions of poverty reduction and more that we will talk later. But I realized that they didn't want any like technical solutions, and my work was not impacting their yeah
Sure.
we were sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish. Sorry. I'm sorry.
No, like at the time we were also like managing like the negotiations with a coalition of people who had lost their jobs during the pandemic, like mariachi singers, like restaurant workers that were advocating for a universal minimum income during the pandemic so that they could like go through the hardships economically, a policy most progressive countries in the world had implemented. Even Brazil's with Jair Bolsonaro ultra-right government at that time was like obligated from Congress to imply this policy. And AMLO at the next day said in the mañanera like, oh, we are not gonna give money to people just because these people who didn't want to give money to old people and were conservatives before uh, now want to give money to the people. So I learned that yeah, he was not about the radical change that I thought, and my working government was not going the way towards I believed it was. Sorry, that was extensive.
No, I think it's great, and I think well, there's two things that I'd like to like say before I jump and ask Shenali something about what you just said. First is I think we should explain what the mañanera is. Like that's something that we are used to saying in Mexico because the previous president AMLO had like every morning he would have a press conference. Was it 6 a.m. Alex? I think, or would it start like super early?
Yeah.
So he would have that, and it became part of his platform and also part of his I guess political personality, where he was just like very outward and talking. So that's an important I guess difference.
So he's sort of seen as like a man of the people, speaking directly to the people.
Yeah, every morning, like getting up early, like kind of connecting to the working class, where I get up in the morning, I do my thing, and I talk, and I let you know what's going on. And I think that's an important aspect that Alex mentions. And first, just clarify what the mañanera is, because that's not like a common word. And the other thing that's more related to what we're going to talk about today is Alex said that the Mexican economy is more connected to politics than it is in the U.S. Like the U.S. economy is more, how did you say that, Alex? Private
Yeah, I
from the
think
private sector.
most people that study economics in the US are aiming going to like Wall Street or like private sector jobs, while in Mexico they're mostly trying to get into politics or academics.
Right. So the link is like it's more direct. The link between politics and economics in Mexico is I guess more direct than it is in the US. So I was wondering if that's another like a similarity that we didn't mention before in the previous conversations that we had. But is that similar to how things are in Sri Lanka?
Well, yes, I would say that working in the public sector is huge in Sri Lanka and most developing countries. Sort of a public sector job is kind of your stability and a lot of prestige granted onto you. And most universities and programs you go kind of, form a pipeline that would allow you to work for the government. That was part of the huge reason why the economic crisis hit so hard in Sri Lanka is because, the middle classes, swaths of like public sector employees sort of felt it the hardest. They also faced the greatest instability when the sort of whole political system collapsed. And so there was the actual insecurity of like your job and what you're going to eat. And then also this question of like, is the department that I work for or the ministry even going to be here in a year's time? So I would say, yes, the U.S. does a good job at seemingly like disembedding the market from society and making it seem like it's a separate thing and you go work in like a siloed off Wall Street. I think also like the orientation of economics in the U.S. is like capital accumulation,
Right.
Maintaining a sort of global U.S. empire, whether that means sort of maintaining economic dominance through like just these various markets and industries.
Yeah, but it's definitely more like it's more embedded like in everyday conversations. Like it's not. Yeah, like it's difficult. Like Alex said, like this to differentiate, and also like you said, when there's a change in government and where there's something in government, like a lot of people suddenly have to think about what's going to happen, to them economically and their jobs because the economy is so, linked to politics.
Totally. I think in Sri Lanka, it's really obvious because there's a direct link between sort of British colonialism,
Right,
working in the civil service and the civil administration for the British. Those state structures and that sort of pipeline remains in place well after independence. And so it creates this like dependence on the political system, perhaps in ways that in the US is not like as readily felt.
right.
Yeah.
All right. So before we get into that or we get lost into that, let's move back into the two articles that you recommended for us to read, which I have to be honest, I kind of just glossed over, but
That's fine. I think you get like the basic overview, and that was my intention, just to kind of give an overview of these moving parts.
Yeah. So tell us about the two articles that you sent.
Yes. Also, so sorry. I know that we're recording, but is there a possibility for me to see Alex so we can like?
Yeah, I guess I could edit this part out. Me too. I'm having a hard time, Alex, because the screen for some reason shut off. So I'm looking that way, but I'm looking at a blank screen.
Yeah.
kind of like pretending that I'm looking at Alex. So I'll have to edit this out. Yeah, let me see if I can get that television worked on. I agree. I'm glad you said that because I'm like, shit, this is weird.
Yeah, we're having a conversation.
And so tell us then about these two articles that you sent us to read.
Yeah, so the first article was by Harinder Dissanayake and Rajni Gamage. I actually worked with Dr. Rajni Gamage for my master's thesis, which is an aside, but she's great. She's a academic and also a political activist in many ways. So that first article was kind of like an overview of the 2024 elections that took place in Sri Lanka, the presidential elections, the parliamentary elections, and kind of who the main players were at stake. And this was a really important election because it was the first election in the country since the economic crisis and the ousting of the Rajapaksa government, which was decisively kind of attributed to the Aragalaya movement, which was a mass sort of political movement. You can disaggregate the movement. That's kind of what my work is on. I don't think it was this singular movement, but multiple movements kind of working together, really rallying for this like central promise of systemic change. So that was that first article. And then the second article was actually something that I had written for a local, it's called a Citizens Journal, Ground Views. And I wrote that pretty much, let me think. The Argyle, the occupation was brought down in August of 2022. And so I wrote that piece in October 2022. I think I read it back and I was like, yeah, the emotions were raw. I was pissed.
I liked it.
Yeah, thank you. Because it actually ended up turning into like my master's work and what kind of compelled me to even apply to graduate school. So yeah, that was kind of I was grappling with the moment of kind of what had happened in 2022. The Argyle, it felt like this real moment of political possibility. It was sort of my like awakening in sort of the Sri Lankan context.
Right.
Because, Sri Lanka endured a civil war that ended in 2009. We had been under the Rajapaksa government for since then, essentially, severe crackdowns on like political dissent and freedom of expression and sort of the torturing and abduction of journalists. I'm sure these are maybe common stories that you all are familiar with.
So you said 2009 though. So this was since 2009. Now before that, were things different, or had this political party been like in power for more than that time?
Yeah, so I would say Sri Lanka's always been like a functioning democracy.
Okay.
So the Mahinda Rajapaksa he kind of comes into power in, I believe, 2006. Oh God, I hope I'm not getting that wrong. But he comes in at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and he is applauded as the leader that kind of brings peace to the situation.
Okay.
Lots of human rights abuses, very Sinhala nationalist, sort of government. So it kind of flip-flops between 2009 to 2022 between him, his brothers. There's like a kind of constitutional crisis in 2015 where we see like sort of more left-leaning coalition take power for a couple of years, and then landslide victory of Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2019, which actually transformed the country into a presidential system. We weren't presidential, so he reinstated presidentialism in 2019. Huge crisis at like pretty much every single level of the state. And 2022, you get sort of like this massive state failure. And so the Rajapaksas were essentially seen as the political bandits that had brought on this state failure.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Alex about what he thinks about this. But before, I was about to digress to a really interesting thing that you said, but I'm going to save this one. And I'm just going to mention it. If we have time, we'll talk about it at the end. But this balance, that I deal with, and from what I know about Alex, sounds like he probably deals with it too. And it's like how to balance academics with activism. It's like really hard to like balance, I feel, in many things, but we'll save that for the.
Yeah, I think that's great.
I think we could talk about it at the end, but like when I was hearing Shenali tell like this overview of this whole situation, it did sound a lot like what's happened in Mexico, and I'd like to ask Alex how, after hearing Shenali talk about and explain this, how similar or how different do you think it is to how processes have evolved in Mexico?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are a lot of similarities and some differences. I think the new government by GVP and PP, I think it's said,
Yes.
starts with a platform for like ending corruption, recovering the stolen money of that corruption, and addressing income inequality that is very similar to Morena. Both kind of optimized that strategy, moving into a more big tent format of a party, appealing to center middle class voters. That's what AMLO did to win in 2018, differencing himself from previous campaigns in 2006 and 2012. And kind of this opportunity given by the cost of economic reforms, with very big differences in the case of Sri Lanka, IMF reforms, in the case of Mexico, energy reforms that seek to privatize the energy sector, which is a very arrogated topic for the left in Mexico since Lázaro Cárdenas' expropriation the past century. But then some differences that I see in the first paper that Shenali shared, it said that elites not reaching a bargain opened the opportunity for change, whereas I see in Mexico elites reaching a bargain in the case of the Pacto for Mexico, that was this formal alliance of the big three legacy parties in Mexico that agreed to some reforms, to some economic modernization reforms. And after that, when AMLO separated from PRD, that was the historically left party, to form Morena, he was the only opposition to like this neoliberal reform agenda. So this bargain between the elites actually helped AMLO to be the only opposition in the narrative of opposition to neoliberal reform. So I think this is somewhat different to the case of Sri Lanka. And then I find some differences, I mean, some similarities between AMLO's governing strategy and the SLPP strategy. In particularly destroying checks and balances on the executive, concentering more power on the executive, on this like narrative of similar to Trump also, like the will of the people voted this. So why some technocrats in these institutions are going to stop the will of the people voted on democratically? And then these like state-linked patronage programs to build an electoral machine. I think AMLO perfectioned this in a way that has never seen in Mexican politics. This like narrative of putting social programs in the Constitution is very symbolically important because it tells that nobody is going to take them away. But then they use also campaign with the opposition, the right will take these social programs away. So you have to vote for maintaining Morena in power. So I think that's similar to what CLPP did with what I understand very briefly from one paper. But then one key difference that I think is very interesting is this, that they say the atomization of society was kind of a strategy to demobilize, while I think in Mexico and other cases like Chile has been very different, where the left has seek to like politicize and mobilize its base to perpetually occupy the public space and also the digital public space with their agenda. And finally, I think it's very interesting the role of small parties and alliances in both cases. In Mexico, where we have this kind of over-representation law with our proportional representation system. So after the 2000 transition to democracy, where the PRI 70 years in power were defeated, they did this reform to give more power to the party that wins the presidency so that he can do reforms and pass things, because in the year 2000, Fox couldn't pass anything. So after this, the present party wins almost always a majority, at least in one of the chambers. But in the case of AMLO, he used smaller parties like the Partido Verde and the Partido del Trabajo to gain more seats using the proportional representation system. And then with the coalition, they got to cheat one very important law in Mexico, that is, no party should have more than 8% over-representation in the chamber proportional to the votes they had. So AMLO and his coalition, using this tweak, have more like a 20% over-representation in Congress vis-a-vis what the people really gave them in the urns. So I think this is very interesting, very different, because we don't have this like second and third ranking choices electoral system, but they have a very central role in the victory. And maybe later we can talk about the changes between AMLO and Sheinbaum, because I think it's very interesting for comparison as well.
Yeah. So, real quick, I agree. Like, I have to say, overall, I like, the direction Mexico is heading at this time, but I also feel it's in many ways dangerous, like Alex says. So you mentioned there is an issue with overrepresentation, and you explained that quite well. But you also mentioned the destruction of checks and balances, and you didn't say so much about that. So could you tell us a little bit more of how the government in Mexico is doing this? How are they destroying these checks and balances?
Yeah. I think before that, I should say, I think AMLO got elected on three directives mainly: ending corruption, reducing economic inequality, and reducing or destroying elite capture of institutions. And this elite capture was very different in different examples. You can see Gabriel Garcia Luna, who is trialed in the US, our ex-secretary of like who manages the police in Mexico, was basically colluding with the cartel of Sinaloa, and he's being charged in the US by that. That's one kind of elite capture by the cartels, but also like these technocratic elite captures of the old elites in the judiciary and other institutions. So what AMLO has done is, I think, at least three ways of destroying checks and balances. One is giving a lot more power to the military, and this is the one that worries me the most. The military has seen more than 300% increases in AMLO's government. They have started building airports, roads, controlling everything from ports to entries in the aduanas on the north of the country, to stopping migration after Trump demands it. The military is basically what AMLO uses to execute the most important policies in Mexico, and they're gaining so much power that narratives of a candidate coming out of the military have been introduced in Mexico for the first time in many, many years. That's one thing. The other thing is the judicial reform, the most controversial in the US. Basically, the judicial reform makes every judicial position in Mexico electoral. So we're going to vote to elect the Supreme Justice ministers, but also the local judges. And even though uh, structurally I don't think it's a good idea, the execution has been worse. So the execution has been truly pathetic. Federal judges that apply justice to the whole country are going to be elected by a single municipal in Mexico City. The only states that really matter in the election are the biggest states: Mexico City, Estado de Mexico, Nuevo León, and Jalisco. All the other states basically don't matter for the election. The three like government branches were going to put candidates: the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. The judicial forfeit, so they're not even going to present candidates. So all of the candidates are Morena's candidates. So that's two. And three is eliminating this like very Mexican institutions. I don't think there's a comparison in other parts of the world. They're called this like autonomous institution, constitutionally autonomous institutions that the transition to democracy built to manage elections, manage economic competitivity, guarantee access to transparency. So these were constitutional autonomous institutions that had their own budgets, that were elected with meritocratic, technocratic criteria, and they were stopping a lot of AMLO's reforms, like the Tren Maya, like the judiciary reform. So these autonomous institutions and the judiciary who were blocking his reforms, he basically campaigned on destroying these institutions, which I think is very interesting for the 2024 election, because Mexicans were presented with two narratives: the main Morena narrative, that these institutions obstruct the way of economic justice, so we have to destroy them. and the opposition that said that, oh, democracy, we need democracy. So economic one, the people, a very big majority of Mexico prefer economic programs than democratic institutions. But nevertheless, I think the presidency is concentrating a lot of power, especially because in Mexico we have this thing called meta-constitutional powers of the president. When the president also controls the main party and is the leader of the party, it gives additional powers to the president that are not in the constitution. So this particularly towards the military worries me the most. But I have to agree that I like the el fondo. Sorry,
Yeah, the
English.
direction. I guess the general
Yeah,
direction.
Yeah, like he reduced poverty by 5 million people. Yes, increased the minimum wage as we haven't seen in 30 years. So that I like a lot, but I don't know if the costs of giving the country towards militarizations are worth it. There were other ways.
Yeah, it's a complex. I mean, you're saying these things, and I'm just going like in circles in my head. I'm not even gonna try to answer any of this. I'm just gonna focus on what we're gonna talk about today, which is like if there are any similarities. Now that Alex has given us like a really great description of what's going on in Mexico, at least until AMLO, because when Scheinbaum comes in, there's another thing, but maybe we'll have time to talk about it. Maybe we won't. But how would you say that's similar or different to what you know about what's going on right now in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was a great overview. I think as you were speaking, I was like, oh my God, that sounds similar, and that sounds similar, and that sounds similar. I think there's like numerous differences, but like just to focus on like, okay, starting off with like big picture similarities, I think Mexico and Sri Lanka are geopolitically positioned interestingly in that both are neighbors to like sort of the regional hegemon, whether it be the United States or India in the case of Sri Lanka. Right now in this current election with sort of the victory of Scheinbaum in Mexico, our president right now in Sri Lanka is not a woman, but our prime minister is, and that's arguably perhaps even a more important role. Dr. Haranyama Surya. So there's a gendered political dynamic that's come into play recently as well, and like sort of maybe speaks to the hopefulness of the moment. I think that the military question is really fascinating to me and not something I knew much about in the case of Mexico, because the military in Sri Lanka continues to be the largest employer in the country. I believe it's like the greatest budget allocation it goes towards the military still, even though we've been in, quote, peacetime since 2009. So that has continued despite sort of whatever political change or changes have happened in the last few years in Sri Lanka. I think there's a really interesting and difficult question in Sri Lanka right now, which is the continued like ethnic national question, which was kind of the root of like the Sri Lankan civil war between the sort of Sinhala majority and the Tamil minority of the country, predominantly living in the north and the east. I think there was like a sense maybe in 2022 in the Aragalaya that a call for systemic change would also address sort of the ethnic question, which it decisively has not. And I am sure it's the same in the case of Mexico, whether it be towards like sort of indigenous and other minority communities. I don't know how much they're being integrated into like sort of the new vision for the Mexican state. I think that's always the question that no matter how progressive the government is, that's like the real sticking point. So those were just like my big, and then the idea of AMLO coming into power on sort of like those three key platforms, Alex, what you were saying, which was, I think it was like ending corruption, addressing income inequality, and
destroying like the capture of how the elite captured institutions.
Absolutely. And I think that's just like so on point, on brand for like the MPP in Sri Lanka right now, which makes me nervous.
Yeah.
Which makes me very nervous for the MPP. I will admit that I too was like very hopeful and felt good when this election happened. It was sort of a breakaway from the elite circulation that's probably being talked about in the article. think you have to always be careful when parties come in on sort of the back of like these really promising, energized movements calling for sort of like the empowerment of working class peoples. Lots of grandiose promises and lots of like rhetoric and lots of like energy. That is like the question on my mind as I like kind of watch the Sri Lanka case unfold. I see it like every day, little things where I'm like, ugh, it's not really how things were maybe supposed to be going. But yeah, I think it's very interesting to me that I see the similarities between AMLO and MPP, because obviously Mexico has moved on from the sort of AMLO moment. So
there's some kind of continuation.
there's yeah.
But speaking of that continuation, and then I'm probably gonna try to jump to another topic. But you also mentioned, I remember in the conversation, that when you presented your work in class, and also you just said it right now, the Prime Minister, you said Doctor. I didn't catch the name. Like.
Oh yeah, Harini Amarasuriya.
So
yes.
she's like, she has like an academic background, or why did you say doctor? Which is another similarity I think that's happening. That there's just like underlying similarity there.
Yeah, totally. I didn't even recognize that I said doctor because I know her as an academic. Because
Right.
yes, she is an academic, and now she's prime minister. So perhaps I can drop the doctor or and just
I don't know.
Prime Minister Amarasuriya. No, yeah. So I think it's very interesting. She's always been quite active within politics. She's had a role in government for several years, but a lot of her work is on sort of like protests and counter-protests and civil society in Sri Lanka, and quite like provocative work. She's trained as an anthropologist, and so coming into office now, when she's always sort of been on the side of the people. I used to work in like a think tank, a number of civil society organizations in Colombo, and so would encounter Amarasuriya's work or see her at press conferences. It's interesting to kind of see her positionality fundamentally change, right? From being sort of on the side of like the dissenting civil society to now occupying the second highest office in the country.
So Alex, Doctora Sheinbaum or Presidenta Sheinbaum? I think that's another.
I got that. Yeah.
Prime Minister or doctor. Yeah. Is it the same? What would you say about that, Alex? Like,
I think it's interesting. A lot of people who are from Morena and hold her dearly prefer to call her Doctora Sheinbaum than President Sheinbaum. I think maybe to reinforce this narrative that she's like this environmental scientist that's gonna pay attention to other things. But I actually think her academic background is the least interesting part of her profile, because she was a brigadist for the AMLO campaign and like managed territorial implementation of brigades, which I think very fortified her position in the party. And hearing Shenali, I think something that I would be very observant. It's to deliver these like big structural changes. I think it's very important how you win the election. I don't know much about Sri Lanka's politics, but in Mexico, AMLO had to do alliances with local elites of the old parties and elites of cartels. I don't know the situation of Sri Lanka there, but it's very complex in Mexican politics. And AMLO actually entered with a gabinete, like
cabinet.
a cabinet full of left-wing academics from the more prestigious universities in Mexico. By the first year and a half, most of them had resigned. One of them, the economic ministry, which I had worked with. So I think it's very interesting how these the differences between how academics and people who were more territorial based have evolved in AMLO's government. And now with Sheinbaum, I think one of those key variables has changed. Like AMLO didn't need to work with social movements and NGOs because he had so much power. So he didn't need any of them. But now with Claudia, that power is a little more divided between the executive and the legislative. She has been a lot more open to working with social movements and NGOs. And I think that's a very important opportunity, especially because she's a much better administrator than AMLO, an executor of public policy.
Yeah, I mean, I remember what I heard you talk in class, and I'm like, shit, sounds like Mexico.
Yeah.
Like, I walking up to you like, yeah, this. We need to sit down and talk about it, and here we are. Finally, it happened, and we're talking about these differences and similarities between the political change in Mexico and Sri Lanka, and I'm gonna try to jump and see how this goes, but. You also talked in class about like thinking more about theory and analyzing the things that are happening. I think we were talking about like, telling stories and explaining the situation. But then theoretically, how do you frame this? Like I remember something that I really enjoyed listening when you were talking is how these I guess social movements that start to form in social media and more underground media outlets, how they actually manifest in reality, like in a physical representation or a physical manifestation of these things. And then how does that eventually have an impact on politics? And I don't know if I'm framing this wrong, but I'm remembering that from your presentation in class. And so how would you frame this whole situation? And do you think that same framework would apply to what's happening in Mexico at this moment?
Yeah. So I have like two kind of theoretical frameworks I'm playing with, thinking about in grad school. Actually, before I get into that, so the interesting thing with the MPP is that they are sort of a direct legacy of and directly like the child of the JVP, which is the Jonathan Movimiento Perimuna. And that JVP was sort of a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary armed insurgent party, political group / later party that emerged in the 70s. And so the JVP begins as maybe one could say a political movement, a social movement, calling for the sort of armed struggle, capture of state power through revolutionary means, which is pretty typical of like much of the post-colonial world. I mean, colonization leaves you in shambles and you get these series of civil wars and insurgencies and separatist struggles. So it's very interesting to me that I trace sort of that the political power in Sri Lanka right now is sort of a legacy of the JVP beginning as this like renegade, fundamentally also violent movement, which is then sort of co-opted or mellows out, is transformed into a political party and remains a minor party.
How long ago was this? Like when did they start?
As a party?
Yeah.
So there were two major insurrections. The first in like the early 70s, the second, which was the most bloody, in between 87 to 89. And so that was my parents' generation. I have like a lot of sort of personal stories, family trauma from that era. And then transformed into a political party. God, my dates are so bad today. I want to say it's like the mid 90s, like 95 or so. This is around the time when Sri Lanka is reaching one of many unfortunate ceasefire agreements as the Sri Lankan civil war plays out in the background. It's sort of this like political, it's like an opening, I think, for many groups to kind of find their entryway into mainstream politics. But yeah, JVP could never really win because they were battling with this like legacy of armed struggle and not very popular for kind of what happened in that, especially the second insurrection. The MPP is kind of formed as like a coalition, like a spin-off party of the JVP, and then is kind of propped up. So Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who is the current president of Sri Lanka, was also a former leader of the JVP before the MPP was formed, and then goes on to be the leader of the MPP. So that's sort of one element of like the social movement to party politics dimension I'm thinking about. And the second is then, of course, that of like the people and the Aragalea and what happened in 2022. And I think,
So I'm gonna interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Before we even get into this whole theoretical thing that sometimes, because I feel like, you know, going back to the differences and similarities with Mexico, and I'm gonna have to ask Alex this question, but it seems like this happened. So I asked time, and you said maybe 70s, 80s, you know, and it may be kind of consolidated in the 90s. But I feel this happened like in a different time period in Mexico. Or how does that compare with this particular situation in Mexico? Alex, what do you think about that?
For sure. I mean, the main like movements that gave birth to Morena would be, I think, three type of public space occupation. The first one would be AMLO's desafuero, and for context, this is when the opposition tried to take AMLO's protection, like legal protection as a public servant, and make him ineligible for the next presidential election. He took this as a, yeah, like as a statement that he was an outsider. He occupied the main plaza in Mexico for months. Um, then I would say, oh, I didn't do it chronologically. The first one would definitely be the Zapatista movement.
Yeah.
They're now pretty separated. I mean, they're not getting along, but AMLO uses a lot of Zapatistas' key communication strategies. Like when he got elected, he did this ceremony with the Bastón de Mando Indígena. That is a very important symbolism for indigenous communities in Mexico. And he then passed that baton of the indigenous communities to Claudia Sheinbaum. And he also uses a lot of Zapatista phrases like mandar obedeciendo, that is like governing, hearing to the people. Uh, and then, of course, Ayotzinapa, the killing of the 43 students in Guerrero, which he then campaigned with the parents of Ayotzinapa students after failing miserably with the Truth Commission that he started, and kind of reinforcing hiding the truth of military involvement in the killing of the 43 students. So he has used a lot of these social movements energy, but I didn't think he delivered in any of them. And that's why now these social movements are pretty against working with Morena.
Okay. So in the case of Sri Lanka, you said like the origins were leftist, Marxist for this situation, and in the case of Mexico, you would say it was a Zapatista movement. So in that sense, it's a little bit different, I guess. Or do you think there are similarities between that? In I guess ideologically would be my question, Alex.
I think this is a very hard question because I don't think Morena's base is ideologically left.
Okay.
I don't think Mexico is a leftist country. And I think that is a mistake that many leftists have made, including Gabriel Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia, thinking their victory means the country has gone left.
Right.
Is a mistake, I think, because there are other political opportunities or variables that gave away to their victories. In the case of AMLO, corruption, violence, Ayotzinapa, not his ideology per se, but this message of the elites versus the majority of the people. I think that is a similarity. And also what Shenali had mentioned, the geopolitical aspect. I mean, the Zapatista movement insurrected the same day as the TEMEC or the USMC started between Mexico, Canada, and the US. It was this reaction against globalization and the effects that that would do, especially in rural communities in Mexico. I think that is very similar to like this true scare of what the IMF reforms would do in Sri Lanka. what I think is different, and I don't know much, so here, correct me, Shenali, is the violence context. Because, I mean, I don't think any other country in the world can compare. Like, cartels in Mexico are multinational companies that operate in 160 countries that control more cash and weapons and access to weapons from the biggest weapons manufacturer in the world, that is the US. So that puts Mexican politicians and social movement actors in a very, very difficult position. Mexico is the third most dangerous country to be an activist or a journalist because they get killed. So when I worked in a political party in Mexico, a social democratic party, Movimiento Ciudadano, for 2 years, like they killed 13 of our candidates in a year. I went to campaign with a candidate, and the next week he was dead because he said he was gonna tackle corruptions in the judicial for the cartels. So this makes action by social movement and political actors, I think, very different.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think we're gonna have time to talk about that theoretical stuff. It seems,
It's fine.
but unless you guys have another hour or so to go. But yeah, so was that, how does that compare? Like this whole situation with the cartel violence and how intertwined it is with politics. Is there similarities with what's happening in Sri Lanka?
I probably don't know enough about this. Like, I do know that organized crime is something that most states experience, and
Yeah.
Sri Lanka is no different. I know that there's been a lot of fear mongering in recent years around organized crime and sort of like drug smuggling and whatnot. Do I think it was decisive, or do I think it played a role maybe in like the Aragalaya movement in 2022? Not so much, but I do think that the corruption, the sort of enforced disappearances that happened under the Rajapaksa government was kind of seen as like a state level organized crime in many ways, like the Rajapaksa government basically being viewed as sort of a cartel of sorts, perhaps. I don't know. But no, I wouldn't probably readily like map on like such a comparison between Mexico and Sri Lanka. I think that organized crime is like far more entrenched maybe in the political economy of Mexico than perhaps in Sri Lanka. But again, I'm not probably I would probably need to read more on that myself. But I do think it's interesting that at least bringing it to the present moment with the geopolitical angle. Wait, were you saying something,
You're gonna
Alex?
say something, Alex?
Oh no, I thought she had finished. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no worries. I think it's interesting that although you say Mexico is not like a leftist, left-leaning country per se, that there has been this like real embrace perhaps of a more leftist politic at this moment, which feels like amplified given we keep hearing about this global pull to the right, right? Whether it be Trump in the United States or Modi in India or sort of like the collapse of democracy in Europe. There's this like genuine appeal for a leftist or an allure of a leftist politic, I think, and a desire to distance oneself from the legacies of violence that have so often like permeated leftist politics in Mexico and Sri Lanka, right? So like I think the Aragalaya is very conscious of the fact that in the 80s you had this grand like revolutionary leftist movement, and the Aragalaya, at least some activists, I think you can disaggregate it by those who are more like interested in sort of just a political turnover or immediate economic reform. And then you had other people who were like, I'm in it for like a revolutionary struggle because I believe that like an alternative political system entirely is possible, and I'm down to perhaps even destroy it and make a new one.
Right.
And so I think that probably is like taking us a little bit off topic for today.
Well, kind of.
but-
I think we can start a new podcast. Ladies, just stop here. We'll start a new one and talk about this whole complexity about left or right, because I agree with Alex in that it's not that clear. I mean, I think a lot of us who are, I guess, more left-leaning found it really easy to jump on the whole political movement in Mexico. But from a more critical perspective, is definitely not like, completely left, which is, I think, has its pros and cons, because it's not that easy, and also, I think it opens the door. Like if you do go too much, it opens the door for counter movements where you would have like this whole reactionary situation. Like I think it's kind of happening in the U.S. where it's like you've got this whole uprising, or a lot of people also aligning to more of a right wing, quote unquote, way of thinking about politics, which is dangerous. And maybe that backlash might not be so intense in Mexico because, like Alex said, it's not 100% hardcore left wing. I'm gonna we can go on that one for a while. So I'm gonna let Alex finish and comment on what Shenali and I just said, and we'll probably stop it there. So go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. I'll say two things. One related to this like left versus right debate. I think to especially a US audience, like the spectrum is so different. Like the main agendas of the US left, like universal healthcare, like it's a given in Mexico. Like we've had that since the 70s, like since the 60s.
It's the same in Sri
And
Lanka too.
identity politics in Mexico has progressed a lot. Like affirmative actions, we have 50% women in Congress because of them. And we have advanced LGBTQ and abortion laws relatively to other global South countries. But it's not because of Morena or the executive, mainly. It was because NGOs and social movements used the judiciary, now destroyed by Morena, to win some of these big progressive advances like abortion and cannabis. They were won in the judiciary, not by, Morena helped because it didn't stop it like before other right-wing governments had. But I wouldn't say it was part of their agenda that got him elected. Like in Mexico, we're not discussing trans rights or not trans rights. We're not discussing social security. It's not the same discussion between the left and the right as in the US. I think the discussion here is how to reduce economic inequality, how to surpass the Trump 4 years, and how to fix, and that's the last similarity I think with Sri Lanka's situation. How do we fix the pension reforms? Because pension reforms pressures are inhabilitating any big transformation that this government wants. Claudia wants to do this universal care system that I think would be the most successful policy of her sexenio, but we don't have any money because pensions, because debt, etc. And finally, these like social movements debates and how do they transform when they get to government. I think that we could see, as I said, a change between AMLO and Sheinbaum because she needs more cooperation with social movements, more cooperation with NGOs. I think we shall see if these agendas, as the paper that Shenali shared, are taken into real structural reform or they're only like symbolically addressed for another 6 years.
All right, I love it. I'm going to give a teaser for their next conversation because I have a feeling Jose's going to want to do a part 2 with both of you guys. And I think it just naturally came up, but like the difference between, I think, Alex mentioned how culture wars are not a thing in Mexico, or they are, but not to the extent as they are in the U.S. Now, I think we focus more on, economic inequalities, but I think what makes it really difficult in the U.S. is that they're intertwined. Like culture wars and economic, inequality is intertwined with culture and ethnic differences in the U.S. And the conversation gets really, really much more complicated than it is in Mexico. Because here in the U.S., it's like, okay, yeah, there's, Mexican Americans and Black Americans and Asian Americans, and there are economic implications that are intertwined within that conversation. So it's culture and economics at the same time. It seems like in the US that's different from Mexico. And that's a teaser because I'd like to invite both of you guys to talk about now maybe talk a little bit more about the US in maybe a second edition with Jose here, who's probably way better than me at these topics than I am.
You did great.
So I really appreciated you guys being here. I had a lot of fun, and Alex, it was nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you, and thank you for the conversation. I learned a lot about Sri Lanka today.
I learned very much about Mexico today. I feel inspired to go and think about some things really deeply.
Let's go break things. Sounds good. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Alex.
guys.
Bye. All right. That was great.